Crocodilians are one of the most successful groups of reptiles to have ever evolved. Although often referred to as living fossils, this misnomer obscures the true diversity of these animals in the past. The lineage that gave rise to the crocodilians, called Pseudosuchia, includes a whole host of incredibly varied groups that occupied all sorts of different niches in the past. There were once fast-running terrestrial pseudosuchians, fully marine forms, heavily armoured tank-like forms, terrifying bipedal forms that would have been the apex predators of their day, and even herbivorous ones. But the crocodilian body plan that we're most familiar with today, namely robust semi-aquatic reptiles with flat snouts, has actually evolved on a few different occasions among other groups of animals, a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is a common occurrence when you start looking for it among animals, especially when you examine our planet's fossil record. It makes sense that it would be. When a lineage becomes adapted to a certain environment or a particular niche, the anatomical features that are best suited to this environment or niche will naturally be selected for. So when an unrelated lineage at some other point in time occupies a similar environment or niche, the anatomical features that best enable survival are again the ones that get selected for. This process of convergent evolution therefore means that various groups of organisms that do not share a particularly closely related common ancestor can end up looking remarkably similar, and considering how successful the modern crocodilian body plan has been, it's no surprise that it's been done before by a few different groups of extinct animals. In this episode of my series on convergent evolution, we will therefore be taking a look at the multiple times that things have evolved into crocodiles. I'm glad that everyone has been enjoying all my other videos on other cases of convergent evolution too, and I've got loads of ideas for more to do as well. Again, please let me know in the comments your suggestions for other instances of convergent evolution that you'd like to see me cover. There are so many out there. Anyway, let's get into it. Here is every time that things have evolved into crocodiles. To start things off, let's briefly take a look at the evolution of the true crocodilians themselves. As I mentioned, the larger grouping that includes all crocs and their many extinct relatives is called Pseudosuchia. Pseudosuchia is one of two main groups that comprise the even larger reptile group called Archosauria, the ruling reptiles as their name translates. The other major group within the Archosaurs is called Avimetatarsalia, not the catchiest name, but it does hint at what's included within it. The birds, along with the non-bird dinosaurs that they evolved from, plus the pterosaurs and a few other extinct groups. As a quick aside, this means that the only two living representatives of the Archosaur reptiles are the crocodilians and the birds. And yes, that means that birds are indeed a lineage of reptiles, just as they're a lineage of dinosaurs as well. Anyway, the Pseudosuchians first turn up in the fossil record right after the Permian-Triassic mass extinction event, nicknamed the Great Dying, as this was the most severe extinction that life on Earth has ever experienced. They first evolved very early in the Triassic period, approximately 248 million years ago, and almost immediately in geologic terms came to dominate the terrestrial environment of their time. The late Triassic, just as the first dinosaurs and pterosaurs were evolving, was the time of large predatory pseudosuchians such as Postosuchus and relatives, plus the Poposaurids which looked remarkably like theropod dinosaurs, alongside the heavily armoured plant-eating Aetosaurs, and the first of the Crocodilomorphs, the group within Pseudosuchia that eventually gave rise to modern crocodilians. However, another mass extinction struck the planet at the end of the Triassic period about 201 million years ago, and all of the Pseudosuchian lineages, except for Crocodilomorpha, were wiped out. The Crocodilomorphs soon rebounded, however, diversifying during the following Jurassic period. One of the lineages that originated around this time was Thalattosuchia, a group of fully marine-adapted crocodilomorphs. The exact evolutionary relationships of the Thalattosuchians to other crocodilomorphs are not well understood, and it's still a bit of a mystery how they evolved and from which part of the crocodilomorph family tree they branched off from. The subgroup within Thalattosuchia called the Metriorhynchoids are another fantastic example of a different kind of convergent evolution, with some species looking remarkably like ichthyosaurs, as they became suited to a fully aquatic lifestyle. They even lost their armoured scutes, instead having a much more hydrodynamic scaleless skin. The other subgroup of Thalattosuchians are the Teleosauroids, and these reptiles can potentially be considered an instance of convergent evolution on the modern crocodilian body plan. While the Metriorhynchoids fully committed to the open ocean aquatic lifestyle and show some pretty extreme anatomical adaptations for this, some Teleosauroid species appear very gharial-like with their long snouts and bony armour plates, and were still capable of walking on land, being classed as semi-terrestrial. It was thought that most teleosauroids had this general body plan and were therefore all examples of convergence with modern gharials. However, it's been shown that these Thalattosaucians were pretty diverse and filled various different ecological positions during the Jurassic and early part of the Cretaceous, such as semi-terrestrial generalist forms, specialized fish eaters, long and short-snouted generalist feeders, crushers of hard-shelled organisms, and some large macropredators such as the giant Machimasaurus rex. However, the majority of these species were inhabitants of marine environments, though some species did secondarily become adapted to freshwater habitats. Nevertheless, although details of their anatomy differ, some teleosauroid species do look a lot like some modern crocs, despite being pretty distant on the evolutionary tree, so they're a fantastic example of convergence. All sorts of other diverse crocodilomorph lineages also evolved in the Jurassic period. These include the remarkable Notosuchians, a particularly anatomically variable group with members that had duck-like snouts, some with mammal-like teeth, some herbivores with small pug-faced species, others with rabbit-like incisors that projected forwards from the mouth, armadillo-mimicking forms, the so-called boar croc Caprisuchus, plus giant carnivorous species. Needless to say, the Notosuchians are a fascinating group, and I could probably do a whole video on the various instances of convergent evolution found within them. The Notosuchians went extinct during the Miocene epoch around 11 million years ago, with the Sebecids being the only lineage to survive the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous that wiped out the non-bird dinosaurs. The Jurassic also saw the origin of the Neosuchians, the more inclusive lineage within which modern crocodilians would eventually arise. Once again, and you may be noticing a theme here, this was an incredibly diverse group of reptiles, including many more species compared to the relatively few crocodilians that are still around today. Looking at the Neosuchians, you'd probably recognize most members of this group as being pretty similar to the modern crocodilian body plan, and the majority of Neosuchians were probably semi-aquatic predators. However, multiple lineages once again independently made the transition to marine life, though they likely still retained the ability to walk on land. These Neosuchian marine lineages include the Cretaceous to Eocene-aged Dirasauridae, though one group within them then reverted back to a freshwater lifestyle. And there are also certain members of Phylodosauridae, which existed from the end of the Jurassic to the end of the Cretaceous. Phylodosauridae is also well known for including the enormous Sarcosuchus, one of the largest of all pseudosaucians, which lived during the early Cretaceous in freshwater ecosystems of Africa and South America. Another significant group of Neosuchians are the Goniophyllidés, which inhabited the northern continents during the latter part of the Jurassic and the Cretaceous period. These Neosuchians, particularly the genus Goniophyllus itself, look very much like modern crocodilians, being described as the earliest of the crocodilomorphs to evolve the modern croc body plan. However, since they are not true crocodilians, we can potentially include the Goniophyllidés as an example of a time when a lineage independently evolved into crocs. So, crocs within crocs. Although, given that most Neosuchians in general had fairly modern croc-like body plans anyway, this might be blurring the line slightly between true convergent evolution and having shared ancestral characteristics. But to argue in favour of convergent evolution again, the Goniophyllidés did originate before the true crocodilians themselves did, being known from the mid-Jurassic onwards, whereas the crocodilian crown group appeared in the late Cretaceous, so that's quite a time difference. There are quite a few other Neosuchian groups, such as the Sussisuchids, the Paralligatorids, the small-bodied Atoposaurids, and the Stomatosaucids, the so-called pancake crocs, with their long, flat and blunt-snouted mouths. Neosuchia also gave rise to Eusuchia, which is where we again pick up the evolutionary history of the modern crocodilian lineage. Eusuchia, which originated in the early Cretaceous period around 130 million years ago, includes the Hylochampsids, small animals with short snouts, thickened cranial bones and enlarged crushing teeth, as well as the Allodapasuchids and the genus Borealosuchus. These groupings are all very close relatives of Crocodilia itself, which originated during the late Cretaceous around 94 million years ago. Crocodilia includes the three lineages that are still alive today: the crocodiles, the alligators plus caimans, and the gharials, which includes the gharial and, somewhat confusingly, the false gharial. However, once again, their past diversity was even greater, with an extinct group called Planocraniidae also potentially being a member of Crocodilia. The Planocraniids are nicknamed the hoofed crocs, so called because they appear to have had very blunt claws and may have walked on them somewhat like a hoofed mammal. These fantastic reptiles lived just after the non-bird dinosaurs went extinct, from about 62 to 40 million years ago, and seem to have been yet another instance of crocs becoming terrestrially adapted again, likely as a result of many new ecological niches opening up after the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The other lineages of modern crocodilians underwent many interesting evolutionary developments too, such as the appearance of some absolute giants within crocodilids, such as Euthecodon, in the alligatoroids, the infamous Deinosuchus, as well as the much younger Perasaurus, and the Gavialoids, including the very large Gryposuchus and Ramphasuchus. All these giants approached around 10 meters in total length, and according to some estimates, some may have grown even larger. Today, 28 living species of crocodilians are recognized, and although there are notable differences in their head and skull anatomy, such as in the length and width of the jaws, correlating to different specific ecologies, overall these reptiles can be described as robust semi-aquatic predators with flat skulls and a generally conservative postcranial body plan. So then, as you can see from this immensely abbreviated history of crocodilian evolution, these animals are far from living fossils that have barely changed in 250 million years, as is often claimed. They have had a fascinating and dynamic evolutionary history, occupying a surprising array of niches over the vast stretch of time that the Pseudotsuchians have existed. And what we see today is merely the tip of the iceberg in terms of crocodilian diversity. And they've even convergently evolved on themselves a few times, which is just wonderfully confusing and a brilliant example of how the same ecological and environmental pressures can result in some very similar biological solutions. Speaking of which, now it's time to look at every time that other groups of animals have converged on crocodilians. To begin with, we're moving away from the reptiles and, believe it or not, to a group of amphibians. Yes, that's right, there were some prehistoric amphibians that evolved to look very much like crocs. I'm talking about the Temnospondyls, a huge and diverse grouping of vertebrates that potentially gave rise to the modern amphibian group, called Lysamphibia, though some studies find it more likely that Lysamphibians had their origin with a different prehistoric grouping. Temnospondyls, excluding Lysamphibia, existed from the Carboniferous period some 330 million years ago and died out in the early Cretaceous, around 120 million years ago. A few different lineages within Temnospondyls actually independently evolved pretty superficially crocodilian-like species, so once again there was some convergence upon convergence among these animals. The croc similarities are also often reflected in the names of these amphibians, as you'll often see their names ending in sucus, which is from the ancient Greek sukos, a translation of the name for the crocodile god Sobek. Now, considering that so far all the crocodilian-like animals we've talked about lived from the Triassic period onwards, you may think that you'd be pretty safe walking by the water's edge if you were to take a stroll through the older Permian period. But you'd be mistaken, and the last thing you'd see could quite possibly be a very large crocodilian-like Temnospondyl lunging out of the water to grab you. During the Permian period, from just under 300 to around 250 million years ago, the Archegosaurids patrolled the ancient waterways. This group, the classification of which has been debated and discussed recently, traditionally has included the short-snouted Melosaurines and the very long-snouted Platyoposaurines. The Melosaurines seem to have reached around 3 meters in maximum length and may have been ambush predators that fed on other Temnospondyls, and their overall skull shapes do look pretty crocodile-like. The Platyoposaurines, meanwhile, are amazingly convergent on modern gharials, with extremely long, slender snouts and therefore an inferred primarily fish-based diet. The Platyoposaurines also include one of the most famous Temnospondyls, and one that is possibly the largest amphibian to have ever lived, Prionosuchus. This early Permian-aged Temnospondyl had a very slender snout and is known from fossils unearthed in Brazil. Like other Platyoposaurines, this species would presumably have been a specialized fish hunter and used rapid sideways movements of its head and snout to capture prey. Based on comparisons between the skulls and body measurements of living gharials and the fossil material known for Prionosuchus, paleontologists have estimated total body lengths of around 10 meters for this Temnospondyl, which, if true, would make it the largest amphibian ever known. The Archegosaurids lacked the bony osteoderm armor of crocodilians, and looking in detail at their skeletal anatomy, there are clearly many differences between these amphibians and crocodilians. Still, it's therefore pretty incredible how they evolved to look so similar overall, again demonstrating the power of convergent evolution. But the Archegosaurids were not the only time that Temnospondyls converged on crocodilians, although really we should be saying that crocodilians converged on the Archegosaurids, since they lived long before them. Anyway, the Temnospondyl lineage Trematosauroidea is another instance of a separate evolutionary convergence. These amphibians lived during the Triassic period and possibly into the Jurassic, though this is not certain. They were all aquatic and likely fed on mainly fish, and most had elongated snouts, although the snout proportions again vary between members of the grouping, indicating different lifestyles and specializations. The subgrouping Trematosaurenae includes species with shorter and more alligator or crocodile-like snout proportions, while the other subgroup Loncorhynchinae possessed more slender and gharial-like jaws. In fact, one recently named species from Madagascar was even called Aphanorama gavialamimus, the species name meaning gharial mimic, due to the extreme elongation of its snout. Some Trematosauroids seem to have been adapted to a fully marine lifestyle too, since their fossils have been uncovered in shallow marine paleoenvironments in addition to deltaic, coastal and river deposits. So they can also count as a convergence on the Thalattosuchians, which would evolve after them in the Jurassic period. But that's not it for the Temnospondyls. It seems that before the Pseudotsuchians occupied all the croc niches, the Temnospondyls were just running riot with turning into croc-like things. Another instance of this can be seen within Capitosauria, a very large and diverse grouping of Temnospondyls that again lived during the Triassic. Capitosaurs were one of the most abundant groups of Temnospondyls in this time period, and have been found worldwide. They are relatives of the Trematosauroids, and include quite a few fairly croc-like members with lengthened snouts, such as Mastodonsaurus, Eriosuchus, Cherninia, and Xenotosuchus, among others. The Capitosaurs are considered to have had mostly aquatic lifestyles due to the anatomy of their postcranial skeletons, and mostly consumed fish. However, Capitosaurs such as Mastodonsaurus may have also taken out other Temnospondyls. Indeed, the species Mastodonsaurus giganteus could grow to pretty enormous dimensions, approaching 6 meters in total body length. So this would not have been an amphibian you'd have wanted to get in the water with. Yet another example of a different group of Temnospondyls evolving into crocodilian-like things is the case of Benthosuchus and its relatives. Benthosuchidae is currently represented by 3 different genera, known from Russia and Brazil, and the classification of Benthosuchus itself has been a subject of discussion among Temnospondyl workers. Despite having been placed as a Trematosauroid and a Capitosaur at various times in the past, Benthosuchus and friends do seem to be a distinct group that lies outside these others, and therefore they potentially count as another independent evolution of a croc-like body plan. A much younger Temnospondyl that sort of fits into a very loose definition of being somewhat crocodilian-like is the well-known Coolosuchus, made famous by its appearance in Walking with Dinosaurs. Coolosuchus is significant among these amphibians for potentially being the last of the Temnospondyls, going by the classification of modern amphibians outside of this group, since it lived during the early Cretaceous about 120 million years ago. It didn't exactly have an elongated snout like a croc. In fact, it had the complete opposite with very broad, rounded jaws, but it was rather large and potentially occupied a similar niche. Interestingly, it has been proposed that the reason Coolosuchus survived so late when all the other Temnospondyls had died out is due to it living near the South Pole, which may have acted as a sort of safe harbour from crocodilomorphs that might have outcompeted it by taking over the same ecological position. So the Temnospondyls are a brilliant case of convergence, with these amphibians evolving to fill the vacant niches that would eventually be occupied by true crocodilians and their relatives. Moving from the Temnospondyls to another group of tetrapods that existed during the Paleozoic era, we come to a lineage called Embolomeres. The Embolomeres lived in the Carboniferous and Permian periods, between about 345 and 255 million years ago, and though their classification has been debated in the past, they are now generally agreed to be a very early branching member of the reptiliomorphs, so closer to reptiles than to amphibians. The Embolomeres were particularly diverse during the Carboniferous period and inhabited the tropical swamp forests of the time, but suffered a loss in diversity across the Permian period, potentially as a result of the general increase in arid conditions. Embolomeres could reach pretty respectable sizes, potentially over 4 meters in length, and represent some of the first large carnivores to evolve within the tetrapods. You may be familiar with a couple of Embolomere species that have been reconstructed in paleontological media, such as Proterogerynus in Walking with Monsters and Anthracosaurus in the recent Life on Our Planet, both of which appear superficially quite croc-like. Many Embolomeres are considered to have been semi-aquatic predators, and indeed their anatomy seems well suited to this kind of lifestyle. The The anatomy of their skulls is again quite variable, and the genus Archaria, which lived during the early Permian and is known from Texas and Oklahoma, possesses a rather more elongated snout, leading to interpretations of this Embolomere as a fish-eating, gharial-like creature. So, for as long as tetrapods have been hauling themselves about with legs instead of fins, there have been croc-like things around, it seems. The Paleozoic would therefore definitely not have been a safe place to go strolling by the water's edge, and hopefully this video has now dissuaded you from ever being tempted to do so. Next, we're heading back to the reptiles again for the next instance of convergence on the croc body plan. These are the Phytosaurs, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that they are just some kind of prehistoric crocodile or gharial because, I mean, just look at them. They're an absolutely astonishing example of the power of convergent evolution, with long low bodies, short sprawling legs, elongated snouts, and a mostly semi-aquatic lifestyle. Phytosaurs are again an entirely Triassic lineage, with some potential fossils known from the early to mid-Triassic that might represent the oldest members, but they are primarily recognised from late Triassic-aged rocks. In fact, they're some of the most common tetrapod fossils found in certain late Triassic formations, especially in the western US. So if they're not crocodilians, then what are the Phytosaurs? Although hindered by their fairly restricted fossil record, with no known definite earlier Triassic ancestor to reliably link them to other reptiles that lived at this time, they are most likely members of the major grouping called Archosauriforms, which includes Archosauria, which we mentioned earlier, and therefore all the Pseudosaucians, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, birds, plus a bunch of extinct groups. However, Phytosaurs are not themselves members of Archosauria. They have in fact been found to be the sister group to Archosauria, meaning they're the closest relatives. So since they're not Archosaurs, that also means they're not Pseudosaucians, although they were previously thought to be. They are therefore a completely separate branch of the reptile evolutionary tree that independently evolved the crocodilian body plan, long before the true crocs arrived on the scene. The reason for such a striking similarity is of course probably to do with the lifestyles of the Phytosaurs. These reptiles are mostly found in geological formations that represent ancient rivers, lakes and floodplains, and the anatomy of many species seems to be perfectly suited to life as a semi-aquatic ambush predator. The diversity of Phytosaur skull and jaw shapes was thought to strictly correlate to their diets, based on the ecologies of modern crocodilians, with very slender snouted Phytosaurs hypothesized to only feed on fish. However, stomach contents have been found of the slender snouted Parasuchus, which includes the bones of other reptiles, suggesting that they could still be pretty generalist feeders, though their general skull anatomy likely still does correlate to their primary feeding ecologies. Despite superficially looking incredibly similar, however, there are some key differences between Phytosaurs and crocodilians. The most notable of these is the position of the external nostrils, which in modern crocs are located at the end of the snout, whereas in Phytosaurs they are retracted and positioned much closer to the eyes, almost like a whale's blowhole. This nostril placement is an additional indication of their semi-aquatic habits, enabling these reptiles to lurk just under the water's surface while still breathing, much like modern crocs. Other differences include the extent of bony armor, as Phytosaurs had a unique structure called the gular shield protecting their throats, made up of many overlapping and interlocking bony plates under the neck. Many Phytosaur species also tend to have serrations on their teeth, whereas modern crocodilians generally lack them. Phytosaurs also differ from modern crocodilians in being more diverse in their ecological roles, since in addition to all the semi-aquatic freshwater species, there were also some marine Phytosaurs and a probable terrestrial species. Mystreosuchus, known from fossils found in Europe and Greenland, comes from marine sediments and also shows stronger adaptations to a more aquatic mode of life. On the other hand, Nigrosaurus, also from Europe and which seems to have lived at the same time as Mystreosuchus, shows indications of a secondarily terrestrial lifestyle. The limbs and hip bone anatomy of Nigrosaurus are strongly suggestive of good walking abilities, and even an erect instead of sprawling gait, indicating that this would have been a capable hunter on land. So then, the Phytosaurs are another brilliant instance of croc convergence, as well as, arguably, a case of convergent evolution with the Thalatosaucians with Mystreosuchus, and the various terrestrial Pseudosaucians with Nigrosaurus. The Triassic was a very good time for croc-like things that weren't quite crocs. Next, it's time to move on to another mind-boggling example of a very croc-like non-crocodilian reptile lineage, Choristodera. The Choristoderes are a remarkable group of reptiles that lived for an extraordinarily long time, and yet often get overlooked. For a long time they were only known from fossils found in late Cretaceous aged rocks at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. Their most well-known member is the genus Champsosaurus, which lived during the late Cretaceous but also survived the extinction at the end of the period, being found in younger Paleocene aged rocks as well. In fact, towards the end of the 20th century, paleontologists started to realise that Choristoderes had been around for far longer than was previously thought. A small lizard-like species from the mid-Jurassic was found to represent a very basal member of the group, and then in 1992 another small Choristodere from France was described, which had been found in late Oligocene aged rocks, just 23 million years old, showing that these reptiles had survived for a very long time after the end of the non-bird dinosaurs. It was named Lazarosuchus after the Lazarus effect, when a lineage turns up in the fossil record, or sometimes still alive, long after they were thought to have gone extinct. A second species of Lazarosuchus was then later discovered, which comes from 20 million years ago, even more recently than the first species. Given that Choristoderes don't seem to be very closely related to any other group of reptiles that lived after the Triassic period, they are thought to have originated at some point during this period. However, no definite fossils of these animals from this time have so far been found, though a few contenders have been suggested. Since it does seem likely that they must have had their origins during the Triassic, this would mean that the Choristoderes, as far as we currently understand, existed for more than 180 million years, which is even longer than the non-bird dinosaurs were around for. So I really think this remarkable group of reptiles deserves some more love and attention. Within Choristodera, it's the subgrouping called Neochoristodera where the incredible crocodilian convergences can be seen. As I mentioned, Champsosaurus is the most famous of these reptiles and has been found in North America as well as Europe. 7 different species of Champsosaurus are recognised, and they could get pretty sizable, with Champsosaurus gigas achieving a length of around 3 meters, nearly 10 feet. Champsosaurus and the other Neochoristoderans had elongate, low-slung bodies with sprawling limbs, long tails, and long, narrow snouts, again looking pretty similar to modern-day gharials. However, there were also many interesting differences between these reptiles and modern crocs. First of all, Neochoristoderans seem to have been far more specialised for an aquatic lifestyle, and although they may have still ventured onto land to lay eggs, they most likely spent the majority of their time underwater. This is suggested by their skeletal anatomy, possessing paddle-like limbs, thickened ribs to help them stay submerged and stable underwater, and forward-facing nostrils at the tip of their snouts that have been proposed by paleontologists to function sort of like a snorkel, meaning they could remain completely under the water for a long time while sticking their snouts up and out into the air. Neochoristoderans were not armoured like crocodilians either, lacking bony osteoderm plates in their skin and instead having many tiny non-overlapping scales. They also had extra teeth lining the roofs of their mouths, which would have aided in prey capture as well as the processing of food and manoeuvring items to the throat. In some of these reptiles, the extent of these extra teeth is pretty crazy, with almost the entire roof of the back part of the mouth completely covered in tooth batteries. In addition, the openings at the back and on top of their skulls are proportionally much larger than modern crocodilians, and since these would have provided attachment sites for jaw muscles, they presumably must have had very powerful bite forces. Given the overall similarities in the shape of the skull and snout between Neochoristoderans such as Champsosaurus and modern gharials, these extinct species are inferred to have had a similar diet of mainly fish and other small prey items. Indeed, biomechanical studies of the flexibility and range of motion of the neck of Champsosaurus are consistent with these reptiles having been capable of sweeping their heads and necks from side to side, enabling them to capture fish from shoals. Other Neochoristoderans likely fed in different ways, however, such as the shorter-snouted Simodosaurus, which seems to have been more generalised and may have fed on aquatic as well as terrestrial prey. In cases where these two genera coexisted, they may therefore have been able to niche partition and avoid competition by feeding on different prey sources. Champsosaurus has been found in a variety of late Cretaceous-aged geological formations, including the famous Hell Creek Formation, home to T-Rex itself. Alongside the slender-snouted Champsosaurus in this formation, a range of true crocodilians with varying snout shapes are also known, showing that the Neochoristoderans were even able to coexist alongside actual crocs by occupying different niches. Neochoristoderans lived from the start of the Cretaceous period past the end Cretaceous extinction and then finally seemed to have died out in the earliest Eocene epoch, around 56 million years ago. However, the other groups of Choristoderans continued on and survived for even longer, though they didn't look much like crocodilians. Choristoderas also happened to convergently evolve on the body plan of another group of reptiles, the Nothosaurs of the Triassic period, which were relatives of the Plesiosaurs. The Choristoderan genera Shokawa and Hyphalosaurus, both from the early Cretaceous of Asia, were very small aquatic animals with elongated necks and tails that don't look like crocodilians at all, instead appearing remarkably similar to the much older Nothosaurs. And just to prove that these reptiles are always full of surprises, there's even a two-headed fossil specimen of Hyphalosaurus that was described in 2006. Yes, you heard that right. This astonishing fossil preserves a malformed embryo of one of these reptiles with two heads and two necks, splitting at the pectoral girdle. It's an example of a condition known as axial bifurcation, which is well documented in lots of living reptiles and occurs when there's an incomplete dividing of the embryo into two organisms. So then, the Choristoderas are a fantastic group of reptiles, as well as another wonderful example of convergent evolution with crocodilians. And again, I really think they could do with some more appreciation given just how interesting they are. Next up, I'm throwing you a curveball as we turn to the mammals. This might be quite surprising to hear, but it wasn't just the reptiles, the amphibians, and the early reptiliomorphs that converged on the croc body many times over, as it can be argued that early whales also evolved to be very much like crocodiles. I am of course talking about Ambulocetus, the so-called walking whale, although we'll come back to that in a minute. Coming from Eocene-aged rocks more than 47 million years old in Pakistan, this incredible prehistoric cetacean filled in an important gap in the fossil record of the evolution of whales from land-living hoofed creatures to the giant swimmers we know and love today. One of the most extraordinary macroevolutionary transitions in the history of life on Earth. When Ambulocetus was first unearthed and described in the 1990s, it was noted for its long snout, eyes elevated towards the top of its head, and limbs that were described as enabling it to locomote both on land and in the water. As such, it was compared ecologically to modern crocodilians, being suggested to have lived as an ambush predator that leapt out at prey on the water's edge, as well as feeding on fish. This therefore paints a pretty striking picture of a mammalian crocodile mimic, lurking in the waterways of the Eocene, propelling itself with its hind limbs plus undulatory movements of its body and tail, and coming out of the water on occasion too. Plus, the anatomy of the skull and the placement of the eyes are remarkably convergent with crocs as well. However, some doubt has been cast on the inferred lifestyle of Ambulocetus, with a study published in 2016 that investigated the strength of rib cages of various mammals, finding that Ambulocetus could not have supported itself on land and therefore was likely fully aquatic. Although it's still up for discussion, with more data needed to clarify its true mode of life. In addition to ancient cetaceans, the argument can also be made that certain features of some modern cetaceans are convergent with crocodilians too. A paper published in 2017 analysed the convergent evolution of skull shape in crocodilians and the toothed whales, stating how both groups have a similar overall range of skull shapes, ranging from broad and short to extremely long and narrow. The researchers used statistical techniques to look at how diet, habitat, and prey size relate to skull anatomy in these animals, finding that gharials and river dolphins in particular are extremely convergent in skull shape. This similarity in snout morphology is mainly driven by their similar diets, being specialized for catching fish, rather than factors involved with living in rivers. Once again, it demonstrates the extraordinary power of convergent evolution, as two lineages that split from a common ancestor almost 290 million years ago ended up with strikingly similar anatomies as they became adapted to feeding on the same prey source. Finally, continuing the theme of partial convergent evolution, I couldn't end this video without at least mentioning the Spinosaurs. These iconic dinosaurs have long been compared with crocodilians, possessing lengthened, narrow snouts with an expansion at the tip, conical teeth perfect for catching fish, and deep tails. In fact, the Spinosaurid Suchomimus even has a name that literally translates to crocodile mimic. Spinosaurs in general, and Spinosaurus in particular, are considered to have been semi-aquatic dinosaurs to some extent, although the aquatic habits of Spinosaurus have of course been the subject of much controversy and scientific debate in the last decade. Without getting into it too much, since it could be a whole video by itself, Spinosaurus from northern Africa and Baryonyx from Europe are argued to have been aquatic foragers that would actually fully submerge and hunt, much like a modern crocodilian. or at the very least to have been semi-aquatic fish eaters that caught prey by wading into shallow waters. Not only do Spinosaurs have remarkably crocodilian-like teeth, which are conical in shape with reduced or absent serrations running up the sides, making them well suited for gripping onto slippery prey items. In fact, here's a great example of one. You can see how conical that thing is, no serrations present either. Anyway, their long skulls also possess extensive bony secondary palates like modern crocs have, and which are not well developed in other groups of theropod dinosaurs. These secondary palates would have made their long narrow snouts more resistant to torsional stresses, and have been linked to adaptations for feeding on fish. Interestingly, Spinosaurs also show a reduction in the extent of one of their openings in the skulls, called the antorbital fenestra. Modern crocodilians don't have these, whereas many theropod dinosaurs had proportionally large ones. And so the notable reduction of the space in the Spinosaurs seems to be another indication of evolutionary convergence with crocs that would have strengthened their elongated skulls. A study that looked at the biomechanics of the skull of baryonyx compared to other theropod dinosaurs, alligators, and gharials even found that the closest analogue to the Spinosaur's skull was a modern gharial, highlighting the striking convergence between distantly related lineages. So most of the convergences between Spinosaurs and crocodilians are present only in the skull, with the bodies of Spinosaurian dinosaurs obviously looking very different to crocs. Despite this, the 2020 publication of tail material from Spinosaurus also suggests that there were some potential similarities between the two groups in this part of the body. The tail of Spinosaurus also turns out to have been composed of vertebrae with very elongated neural spines and chevrons, making it a very deep and paddle-like structure. The tail has therefore been proposed to have functioned as a propulsive organ for locomotion in water, similar to how newts and crocodilians propel themselves, though of course this hypothesis has also been questioned by others. Because again, it's Spinosaurus and everyone just loves to argue about Spinosaurus. So then, the Spinosaurs are another good example of specific bits of crocodilian anatomy convergently evolving in more unrelated lineages, as these enigmatic dinosaurs likely had aquatic tendencies, and therefore the anatomical features for this fish-eating semi-aquatic lifestyle were selected for over the course of the group's evolution. And that pretty much concludes every time that things have evolved into crocodiles. I hope you enjoyed learning about all of these incredible instances of convergence. I had a lot of fun researching them, as I always do with the videos in this series. And again, please do keep your suggestions for more episodes coming. There are so many possibilities for future topics in this series, and it's wonderful being able to spread a fascination with this incredible evolutionary phenomenon to more people. Also, a big thank you to all our channel members for continuing to support us. I hope you've been enjoying the bonus content. Please do consider becoming a member if you would like to support the channel and get access to extra videos. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.